For 2 decades, Gunsmoke demanded that American television audiences believe in a singular, unwavering truth that one man could stand between absolute chaos and civilized order. Every single week, Marshal Matt Dillon confronted brutal frontier violence with a chillingly calm restraint, presenting a stoic facade that suggested nothing on earth could ever truly break him. Yet behind that fiercely controlled image stood James Arness, a man who was quietly carrying far more structural, emotional, and physical damage than just a heavy tin badge and a loaded prop gun. What slowly unfolded in the dusty, fictional streets of Dodge City was not merely an unprecedented milestone in television history. It was a slow, painful, and agonizingly quiet physical unraveling that the vast majority of casual viewers never genuinely noticed. The grand illusion of control became the series' ultimate triumph and its deepest tragedy, masking a relentless production machine that demanded perfection from a breaking man. When the Western first transitioned from a wildly successful radio program into the visual medium of television, the creative team never intended for the adaptation to be comforting, safe, or easily digestible for mid-century families. Instead, the television iteration of Gunsmoke was meticulously engineered to feel substantially heavier, quieter, and uncomfortably closer to the grim realities of historical violence than anything American network television had ever dared to attempt before. Marshal Matt Dillon was explicitly designed to contrast against the flashy, singing, white-hatted cowboy heroes of early cinematic westerns. He rarely smiled, spoke only when absolutely necessary, and rejected theatrical bravado. His immense authority on screen derived entirely from an intense, almost menacing stillness rather than loud threats or performative toughness. This specific narrative restraint was highly deliberate from a directorial standpoint, but it simultaneously exacted a profound physical cost on the lead actor that very few people in the industry fully understood at the time. James Arness was already carrying severe, life-altering bodily damage long before the television cameras even began rolling on the CBS studio lots. Decades earlier, during the height of World War II, Arness had been severely wounded in combat during the Allied invasion of Anzio, sustaining horrific leg and foot injuries that never truly healed properly despite multiple surgeries. By the time Gunsmoke transformed into a demanding, relentless weekly television production, that wartime pain had settled permanently into his massive 6'7" physical frame, creating a constant state of bodily agony. Yet the unforgiving television industry demanded absolute, unyielding consistency above all else. Dillon had to stand tall, effortlessly walk the dusty streets, and project unshakable American strength in every single frame of film. Within the rigid confines of 1950s and 1960s television production, there was absolutely no room allowed for visible physical weakness or vulnerability from a leading male action star. As the grueling series stretched on into consecutive decades, this weekly performance ceased to be mere acting and transformed into an extraordinary, agonizing form of pure physical endurance. Arness gradually learned how to expertly disguise his intense physical strain through highly calculated posture choices, subtle leaning angles, and very specific, deliberate packing. Walking scenes were planned out with the meticulous precision of a military operation, ensuring he never had to traverse uneven ground for longer than necessary. Directorially, long tracking shots were intentionally avoided, and the cameras would frequently cut away to reactions to minimize the time Arness spent on his severely damaged legs. The television audience never saw the immense physical calculations happening just behind the scenes, witnessing only the seamlessly finished, highly polished illusion of absolute control. That very illusion quickly became the narrative backbone of the entire show, establishing a standard of realism that captivated millions of households. At the exact same time, Gunsmoke was quietly, radically redefining the entire landscape of television storytelling and how mature narratives were constructed for mass audiences. Before this era, televised westerns had existed primarily as juvenile entertainment aimed almost exclusively at children, built around cartoonishly clear heroes, predictable plots, and fundamentally obvious villains. Gunsmoke utterly rejected that comforting simplicity, choosing instead to let its episodic stories linger heavily on the devastating consequences of violence, systemic poverty, and moral exhaustion. The characters populating Dodge City did not always win their battles, and sometimes, the mere act of survival felt indistinguishable from total spiritual failure. This uncompromisingly bleak approach made the show a dominant ratings powerhouse, but it also made the production environment increasingly dangerous as writers pushed the envelope. Creative teams consistently pushed into darker, more psychologically challenging territory, forcing directors to stage realistic violence that felt deeply uncomfortable for the era. The line separating fictional Western mythology from grim, gritty reality grew thinner with each passing season, and eventually that fragile line would shatter completely. This terrifying break did not occur within the safe confines of a polished script, but rather right on the chaotic physical set of the production itself. Because for all of its careful aesthetic construction and professional management, Gunsmoke was never truly as controlled or safe as it appeared to the public. The calm, reassuring voice of Matt Dillon effectively masked a frantic production apparatus that was constantly flirting with genuine physical and psychological disaster. What looked completely steady, professional, and composed on the television screen was being held together entirely by chronically exhausted bodies, deeply suppressed fear, and a corporate belief that the show could never afford to slow down. That corporate stubbornness would soon be tested in a tragic, chaotic manner that absolutely no one on the production crew could have ever anticipated. By the time Gunsmoke reached the absolute zenith of its cultural popularity, the production crew had developed a deeply problematic, borderline arrogant sense of confidence in their technical abilities. The season crew had successfully staged hundreds of intense gunfights, simulated saloon fires, and chaotic barroom brawls without suffering any life-threatening or catastrophic incidents. As a direct result of this long-term success, highly volatile pyrotechnic explosions were gradually treated as routine, mundane, everyday occurrences on the studio backlot. Safety briefings became progressively shorter and less detailed, as a dangerous culture of familiarity quietly replaced rigorous, life-saving caution on the set. That comforting illusion of technical mastery shattered instantly during what was originally supposed to be a standard, highly routine special effects sequence. The specific scene in question required nothing overly elaborate, just a carefully controlled structural burn, some atmospheric smoke, and a pre-weakened wooden building designed to collapse harmlessly away from the actors. This exact type of physical effect had been executed safely dozens of times before by the very same special effects technicians. But on this particular afternoon, an unexamined variable caused the entire sequence to go horribly, catastrophically wrong within a fraction of a second. The electrical ignition system triggered far more explosive force than the crew had calculated, instantaneous transforming a controlled burn into a massive bomb. The wooden structure did not merely catch fire and collapse, it erupted violently outward, sending heavy, jagged debris flying through the air with immense pressure. The resulting blast wave was completely immediate, incredibly violent, and entirely unmanageable for the crew members standing nearby on the hot set. Dozens of crew members were violently thrown off balance, while heavy props, massive cameras, and fragile lighting rigs came crashing down into the dirt. Towering flames surged exponentially higher than anyone had anticipated, swallowing the supposedly safe, controlled perimeter in a matter of agonizing seconds. In an instant, carefully rehearsed Hollywood choreography was entirely replaced by pure, unadulterated human panic as people ran blindly for their lives. Some crew members were completely blinded by the thick, toxic black smoke, while others stumbled around stunned and disoriented by the concussive shockwave. Only a remarkably short physical distance away from the epicenter of the blast stood the massive figure of James Arness himself. He was never intended to be anywhere near the actual blast radius, yet the sheer, unexpected force of the explosion reached his position anyway. The concussive wave violently tore his iconic cowboy hat from his head and knocked his massive frame backward onto the hard ground. For several terrifying, breathless seconds, the entire set fell into an absolute, dead silence as thick smoke blanketed the ruined area. It was the specific kind of chilling silence that only real, life-threatening danger creates, where no one dares to speak because the truth might be unbearable. Miraculously, James Arness survived the immediate blast without sustaining fatal injuries, but others on the crew were far less fortunate. Several dedicated crew members suffered horrific, agonizing burns and severe concussions that required immediate, emergency medical transportation to local hospitals. The entire television production was halted immediately, throwing the network's tight broadcasting schedule into absolute chaos and uncertainty. What followed this near-fatal disaster was not just a temporary logistical delay, but a profound psychological reckoning for everyone involved. Network executives and studio officials were forced to directly confront just how close their multi-million-dollar flagship show had come to a literal catastrophe. Stringent new safety regulations were drafted almost overnight, completely changing how physical effects were managed on Hollywood sets. Explosive effects were drastically scaled back, and any future fire scenes required multiple levels of corporate approval before cameras could roll. But despite these new administrative safeguards, the profound psychological damage to the cast and crew had already been deeply inflicted. The traumatized actors and technicians eventually returned to work, but they returned as fundamentally changed individuals operating under a cloud of fear. The iconic Dodge City backlot set no longer felt like a safe, controlled environment where movie magic was effortlessly made. Instead, it felt deeply unpredictable, inherently vulnerable, and constantly threatened by the potential for another catastrophic mechanical or human failure. From that traumatic afternoon forward, the Gunsmoke set carried a quiet underlying tension that never fully lifted during its remaining years. The sense of danger permeating the air was no longer a fictional construct dreamed up by talented Hollywood screenwriters. Everyone on that set now knew exactly how razor-thin the margin between life and death truly was, and how easily their beloved television legend could have ended in a single, irreversible moment of fiery violence. Part 2. Following the devastating backlot explosion, a subtle but undeniable psychological shift permanently altered the daily atmosphere on the Gunsmoke set. The concept of physical danger was no longer an abstract, theoretical notion to be managed by stunt doubles and clever camera angles. Longtime crew members began speaking to one another in noticeably quieter tones, as if loud noises might trigger another sudden catastrophe. Grueling night shoots, which had always been a standard part of production, suddenly felt infinitely longer, colder, and more emotionally draining. The empty, dusty streets of the Dodge City set no longer felt like harmless plywood facades constructed for entertainment. They felt like eerie liminal spaces waiting to be violently disturbed. It was precisely during this prolonged period of heightened anxiety that the strange, unsettling rumors first began to quietly circulate among the night crew. Highly experienced sound technicians working late into the evening reported hearing distinct, disembodied gunshots echoing across the empty sound stages when absolutely no scenes were scheduled. At first, practical-minded studio managers attempted to dismiss these reports as mere technical anomalies or electronic malfunctions within the early recording gear. They blamed audio tape bleed, faulty audio playback systems, or ancient recordings inadvertently triggering at the wrong time through the studio speakers. But these unsettling audio incidents continued to occur with bizarre regularity, even after all physical equipment was thoroughly checked, rewired, and completely replaced. On more than one notable occasion, late-night security cameras captured ambiguous, fluid movement inside background buildings that were supposed to be entirely locked and empty. When anxious crew members rushed into the dark structures to investigate, they consistently found absolutely nothing there but swirling dust and stagnant air. The eerie stories spread rapidly through the production ranks, functioning not as humorous Hollywood gossip, but as genuine protective warnings among colleagues. Some individuals claimed that the historic California land beneath the studio set had once been utilized for intensive military training during the Civil War. Others dismissed those historical theories as mere superstitious coincidence, arguing that the intense stress of the production was simply playing tricks on exhausted minds. What truly mattered, however, was the very real, measurable psychological effect these persistent rumors had on the daily operations of the show. Terrified crew members began flatly refusing to accept overnight shifts, forcing management to constantly readjust the complex shooting schedules. Formal requests for immediate reassignment to other CBS studio productions increased to an unprecedented degree during this incredibly tense era. Even seasoned, veteran actors openly admitted to feeling deeply unsettled when walking the dark, empty Western streets between late-night takes. No official corporate statement regarding these alleged hauntings was ever issued by CBS or the studio management team. Major Hollywood studios do not validate reports of ghosts, but human fear does not require corporate validation to actively exist and disrupt production. At the exact same time, the creative writing on Gunsmoke was organically growing darker, bleaker, and significantly more nihilistic than ever before. The central characters became noticeably less heroic, frequently exhibiting signs of profound psychological trauma, bitterness, and deep moral fatigue. Episodic stories increasingly ended without any semblance of comfort, justice, or traditional Hollywood resolution for the suffering characters. Themes of extreme poverty, psychological desperation, and profound moral compromise completely replaced the clean, satisfying resolutions of early American television. The show was clearly drifting toward something deeply disturbing, and the high-level executives at CBS began to take notice with growing alarm. This creative and psychological tension finally reached its absolute breaking point with an incredibly dark episode that network executives believed went entirely too far. The controversial script abandoned traditional, easily marketable Western conflict entirely, focusing instead on themes of systemic institutional cruelty and total psychological collapse. There was no triumphant shootout at the end, no moral lesson softly wrapped up for comfortable family viewing in America's living rooms. There was only raw, unmitigated human damage left on screen as the final credits prepared to roll. When this specific episode was screened internally for network executives, the corporate reaction was completely immediate, intensely hostile, and final. The top brass decreed that the episode would absolutely not air under any circumstances, locking the master tapes away in a secure vault. The network deeply feared that the horrifying story would linger far too long in the minds of viewers, leaving their massive audience deeply disturbed rather than entertained. Thus, the completed footage was locked away in darkness, remaining unseen for decades and transforming into a whispered, legendary myth among hardcore Western fans. It stood as definitive proof that Gunsmoke had crossed an invisible moral line that mid-century American television was simply not ready to follow. By that point in time, the physical set itself no longer required supernatural rumors or ghost stories to feel deeply haunted. The immense psychological weight of the dark stories they were telling on screen had begun to press down heavily on everyone involved in the daily grind. The atmosphere on set was thick with a palpable sense of exhaustion, as if the boundary between the fictional violence of Dodge City and the real world had permanently eroded. And for the proud man standing directly at the absolute center of this massive cultural engine, the physical and emotional burden was rapidly becoming completely unbearable. Part 3. By the time Gunsmoke finally entered its historic later years, the greatest, most intense conflict associated with the show was no longer being written into the scripts. It was unfolding quietly, agonizingly, and relentlessly inside the aging, battered physical body of James Arness himself. The severe combat injuries he had carried since his youth in World War II had never truly left his massive frame, but the natural aging process drastically intensified everything. Severe, aggressive arthritis settled deeply into his lower legs, hips, and lower spine, transforming every basic movement into a painful negotiation with his own body. Simply walking across the familiar dirt of the Dodge City set, an action Marshal Matt Dillon had confidently performed thousands of times, became a monumental act of pure physical endurance. Yet despite this immense personal suffering, the massive corporate machinery of the hit show could not afford to slow down for even a single week. The network ratings remained incredibly strong, advertisers were paying top dollar, and the production schedule was entirely relentless. Arness, driven by an old-school professional work ethic and an intense pride, fiercely refused to step aside or request a hiatus. Instead, he chose to adapt to his changing physical reality in total stoic silence, keeping his immense suffering hidden from the public eye. The entire daily production apparatus was quietly, drastically restructured around his physical limitations without drawing any unnecessary attention to the true reasons. His extensive scenes were compressed into a single, incredibly grueling shooting day, whenever it was logistically possible to do so. He would arrive on set hours before dawn, work through exhausting blocks of dialogue and complex camera positioning, and relentlessly push his body far beyond its reasonable limits. When the cameras finally stopped rolling at the end of these brutal days, Arness would completely disappear from public view for days at a time. He spent those private intervals resting, receiving intensive medical therapy, and desperately recovering enough physical strength to stand upright once again when the next cycle began. On the television screen, however, absolutely nothing changed to betray this behind-the-scenes agony to the millions of adoring fans watching at home. Marshal Matt Dillon remained completely composed, impressively authoritative, and entirely unshaken by the chaotic world around him. Viewers never caught a single glimpse of the frantic, painful moments between takes when Arness had to heavily sit down, brace his aching spine, or simply close his eyes and breathe deeply through waves of blinding physical pain. The specific performance style demanded an absolute, unyielding stillness, and that very stillness gradually became his ultimate physical shield. This profound physical toll quietly reshaped the fundamental creative direction of the historic series in a variety of subtle, fascinating ways. Heavy action sequences were drastically shortened, high-impact stunts were completely eliminated, and long, sweeping walking scenes were entirely avoided by directors. Complex verbal conversations and tense face-offs rapidly replaced physical movement, fundamentally altering the packing of the iconic Western. What television audiences and contemporary critics enthusiastically interpreted as brilliant artistic restraint was, in reality, a desperate, highly calculated physical survival strategy. The profound cruelty of the situation lay entirely in how beautifully invisible this immense personal sacrifice was to the world. Gunsmoke continuously asked its leading man to perfectly represent unyielding American strength while the production itself was slowly dismantling his physical well-being. There was never any public acknowledgement of his immense suffering, no dramatic on-screen farewell tailored to his physical limitations, and absolutely no corporate accommodations made beyond quiet logistical scheduling changes. The show marched relentlessly forward simply because it always had, driven by the immense momentum of its own historic success. And yet the longer James Arness endured this agonizing cycle, the more incredibly fragile the entire corporate enterprise became. One single physical misstep, one failed medical recovery over a weekend, could have instantly ended not just his historic career, but the entire multi-million-dollar series itself. As his physical body continued to weaken under the immense strain, immense corporate pressure began to build rapidly elsewhere within the network hierarchy. Complex interpersonal relationships among the long-term cast members began to fray significantly after decades of working in close, stressful proximity. Creative decisions made years prior began to completely unravel, as the changing cultural landscape of the 1970s made traditional westerns feel increasingly archaic to network executives. And the high-level executives at CBS, watching the fluctuating ratings data with cold analytical precision, were already quietly preparing for a shocking corporate choice that would soon completely stun the television industry. By the late, final stages of Gunsmoke's unprecedented run, the immense pressure on the show was no longer originating solely from challenging scripts or demanding physical schedules. It was pouring directly from inside the cold, corporate television system that had once fiercely protected the show from cancellation. The weekly Nielsen ratings had finally begun to slip downward, not in a dramatic, catastrophic plunge, but enough to make younger network executives deeply uneasy about production costs. After more than a decade of absolute dominance on the airwaves, the dangerous question quietly forming behind closed corporate doors was no longer how long can this legendary show last. Instead, the cold analytical question became what exactly are we willing to sacrifice to keep this aging, expensive legacy alive for another season? That corporate question soon demanded a swift, brutal answer that would permanently alter the landscape of primetime television. At CBS, the chosen corporate solution to the ratings dip was not immediate cancellation, but rather a ruthless tactical move known as program displacement. The network still believed that Gunsmoke carried immense cultural weight and commanded intense, unyielding brand loyalty from an older, highly reliable demographic that specific advertisers valued. Consequently, instead of ending the show with dignity, they aggressively moved it to a brand new, highly competitive Monday night time slot. Cruelly, this specific time slot was already occupied by another wildly popular, critically acclaimed comedy program that possessed its own deeply devoted younger fan base. The real-world result of this calculated corporate maneuvering was incredibly brutal, instantaneous, and devastating for the creative community. The competing television series vanished from the network's schedule almost overnight, its creative future completely erased simply to buy the aging Gunsmoke more broadcasting time. There was absolutely no public acknowledgement of this ruthless creative trade-off, but inside the tight-knit television industry, everyone understood the grim reality of the situation. Gunsmoke had been officially deemed by the highest echelons of network management as an enterprise that was simply too culturally important to be allowed to fail. The high-stakes corporate gamble initially worked perfectly, as the show's ratings recovered significantly in its new time slot, allowing the production to march confidently forward once again. The historic show extended its legendary reign even deeper into the annals of television history, breaking longevity records with every single passing week. Yet this forced survival left deep, permanent emotional scars across the entire production and the wider television landscape. Devoted fans of the abruptly canceled comedy program never truly forgave the network for its ruthless, unceremonious handling of their favorite show. Disillusioned television critics began openly questioning whether CBS's intense loyalty to fatting legacy had begun to completely outweigh creative integrity and artistic growth. Inside the Gunsmoke cast and crew themselves, the overall morale shifted once again into something deeply cynical and exhausted. The corporate message was now entirely clear to everyone on set. The show would continue to broadcast at almost any human or creative cost. That stark realization deeply intensified the existing, long-festering interpersonal tensions between the veteran actors and the changing creative teams. Highly disciplined performers routinely clashed over experimental creative choices, as the pressure to modernize the show mounted with each passing month. Spontaneous improvisation on set deeply irritated the old-school directors who prized absolute discipline, speed, and strict adherence to the written page. Small, petty disagreements over character motivations gradually hardened into permanent, icy resentments that lasted for years behind the scenes. Yet through all of this internal turmoil, there was absolutely no open conversation about constructing a proper ending, no creative roadmap, and no final chapter planned. Gunsmoke existed in a bizarre, unnatural state of perpetual continuation, operating under the corporate assumption that acknowledging its mortality might cause it to instantly collapse. Ironically, this stubborn, arrogant refusal to plan a proper creative ending guaranteed a far harsher, more disrespectful fate for the legendary series. When the final cancellation notice from CBS finally arrived, it came completely out of nowhere, arriving without any form of Hollywood ceremony, celebration, or respect. There was absolutely no highly publicized farewell episode, no emotional wrap party for the dedicated crew, and no narrative closure for the millions of loyal viewers. There was only an abrupt, jarring silence where a grand, historically significant conclusion should have rightfully been placed. For a landmark television series that had spent 20 years teaching American audiences to live responsibly with the heavy consequences of their actions, the total absence of a narrative ending felt like the cruelest, most inappropriate twist of all. For all of its loud gunfire, dramatic standoffs, and sweeping institutional authority, Gunsmoke was ultimately shaped entirely by what it rigidly refused to show its audience. Nowhere was that definitive creative choice more painfully evident than in the complex, deeply ambiguous relationship that viewers watched for 20 consecutive seasons between Marshal Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty Russell. For 2 full decades, these two iconic characters stood fiercely beside each other through every conceivable frontier trauma, societal shift, and personal tragedy. They protected one another's lives, shared countless quiet looks that were incredibly heavy with unspoken emotional meaning, and yet the script never permitted a single moment of real intimacy. This total absence of physical or romantic resolution was an entirely intentional, highly enforced creative edict handed down from the show's protective producers. The conservative creators firmly believed that a formal romance or marriage would fundamentally weaken Dillon's supreme masculine authority, softening his character in ways the gritty show could not afford. What they created instead was a permanent, agonizing state of unresolved romantic tension that audiences carried with them for multiple decades. Off the screen, the underlying irony of this strict narrative choice was incredibly painful for the actors involved. James Arness and Amanda Blake shared a remarkably easy, deeply genuine natural chemistry in real life, but even that personal connection was heavily policed by the studio. The only time these two legendary co-stars ever shared an on-screen kiss was not within the historic boundaries of Dodge City, but during a commercial. They filmed a brief, highly controversial cigarette advertisement outside the regular series production, utilizing their characters' massive popularity to sell tobacco. For many hardcore, dedicated fans of the show, that fleeting, commercialized moment of physical intimacy felt like a profound creative betrayal. It was a long-awaited emotional resolution delivered in entirely the wrong place, for entirely the wrong reasons, simply to generate corporate advertising revenue. Amanda Blake herself paid an incredibly heavy personal and professional price for her absolute dedication to the long-running series. After decades of beautifully embodying the true emotional, moral center of the violent show, she tragically found her historic role quietly, progressively diminished by the writers. Her polite, reasonable requests for basic professional respect, updated period costumes, and formal corporate acknowledgement of Miss Kitty's immense importance were routinely dismissed as annoying inconveniences. Eventually, after years of systemic corporate neglect, she was removed from the legendary series entirely without any form of public ceremony or proper send-off. This cold, unfeeling corporate decision deeply haunted the entire production long after those responsible refused to openly admit that they had permanently fractured the very soul of the series. Other deep personal sacrifices made by the iconic cast members were less visible to the public, but they proved to be just as physically lasting and damaging. The talented actor Dennis Weaver carried a pronounced physical limp that he had personally invented for his character, Chester Good, for nearly a decade on the air. He eventually made the horrifying discovery that his physical body had learned the unnatural gait entirely too well, permanently damaging his own joints and posture. The brilliant Milburn Stone portrayed the beloved character of Doc for consecutive decades without ever being given a full, proper first name by the writers. It stood as a permanent, frustrating symbol of how even the most essential, beloved characters on television could remain structurally incomplete. And then, of course, there was the historic, deeply hollow ending to the entire enterprise that never truly came to fruition. Gunsmoke did not conclude its narrative journey with grace. It simply stopped broadcasting one day when the corporate axe finally fell from the network suites. There was no heartfelt goodbye from Matt Dillon, no ultimate reckoning for the town of Dodge City, just another standard episode that suddenly, retroactively became the series' finale. For a profound show that had spent 20 years teaching its audience to live courageously with consequences, this total absence of closure felt like absolute abandonment. Yet perhaps that unresolved note is the exact reason why Gunsmoke still lingers so heavily in the collective American cultural consciousness today. Its enduring power lives entirely within that unresolved narrative tension, in the concept of pure physical endurance without any ultimate reward, and in a strength that costs far more than it ever gives back to the individual. What casual television viewers failed to notice at first was that Dodge City was never truly just a fictional place of frontier justice and cowboy heroism. It was an exhausting, relentless place of profound human sacrifice, quiet, deeply painful, and overwhelmingly human to its very core.